So this picture shows my geographic trajectory. So, my name is Dutch, grew up in the Netherlands, and not until I was at the end stage of my college/master's career, and I'll explain that in a second, did I move to the United States back in 1997. So after I moved to the US, I moved to Colorado, then North Carolina, Massachusetts, and I ended up in Rochester in 2004. So I'll go through each of those steps and give you a little bit of a background and of what I did in each of those steps and how I got to the next phase. So this is, I kind of split it up into two different trajectories. The first half is what did I do up until I graduated with my PhD? And then the second half is, what did I do once I got my PhD, and what were the things I was involved with since then? So this is my first half. I'm still young, but looking at that picture, I feel like I'm, not as young anymore as I thought I was going to be. So I'm about 1 year old in this picture. I was born in the Netherlands, Hardingsveld-Giessendam, actually. It's a town that's about 20-30 miles east of Rotterdam, about an hour south of Amsterdam. So I went to primary school, then finished secondary school in the pre-academic track. Then I studied at one university in Utrecht for a year. I explained what happened there. Then I moved to a different university and ended up in Colorado, Chapel Hill, where I ended up getting my PhD. So that's the first half that I'll talk about. And then the second half is, once I got my PhD, what did I do with it? So most of that career will have been here at the U of R, but I did do a couple of years of consulting. I did not do a postdoctoral experience, and I'll explain a little bit why that was, what my thinking or not thinking behind that was. Okay, so let's get moving. And really throughout, as I was working on this, you look at, I've got two children. I got a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old daughter. And when you look at your kids, you realize how much of yourself is in them and how much of them you cannot change, as much as you try to steer them in the right direction. But as I was working on this presentation, I also realized, there are things that are just in me that I'm interested in, that I love to do, that I cannot change. And, I've apparently made it work for me throughout the years. But it really, until I started working on this presentation, it didn't really occur to me so much that, I've always had some of the same interests ever since I was a little kid. And I'm still kind of working in that realm. So the reason I say that is because, I've always loved being outside. I was always an outdoors person, always fishing outside, playing basketball outside, playing soccer, hiking, all of those things. Great. So I've always been interested in the environment and being outside. I've always been a reasonably good student, in elementary school, never had too many academic problems. I did have, perhaps some might argue, some behavioral problems for talking too much. I was always very efficient getting my work done, and then when I was done, I started distracting other people, and I got in trouble for that. Even though I was efficient, I wasn't always very careful with my work, and actually throughout, even when I was doing my PhD work, I didn't always get as good of a grade in courses as I could have had I been more careful. So there are some threads here, some things you realize when you look back. Yeah, I've always been like that. So a little retrospection is kind of fun. Originally, we had a dog. Growing up, we had a pet poodle. Loved the dog. I wanted to be a veterinarian. I think that's not uncommon. But after the dog passed away, I was much less interested in becoming a veterinarian. So after that, I've been more on the nature and environment side since then. So once I graduated, and the picture on the right-hand side is actually my graduating year, 6th grade of elementary school. And I don't know if you can find me. You can see my mouse, right? So this is me here, the bottom right. I actually went on LinkedIn the other day, and I saw this teacher who must be now in her 60s. She was on LinkedIn. I connected with her. She hasn't accepted my invitation yet. So We will see. So as I was going through elementary school at the time, and I think that's still the case, when you're finishing elementary school in the Netherlands, you're basically already selecting a track that drives a lot of your academic career. So we have several different tracks. We have a 4-year middle to high school track, a 5-year middle to high school track, and a 6-year track. The 6-year track is pre-academic. That's the one you have to complete to be eligible to get into university. The 4-year track tends to be more administrative as well as skill-based education. And the 5-year track is when you don't know, you're not good with, administration or your hands, and, you're not sure you want to go into university. That's kind of what the 5-year track is about. So when I went to secondary school, here you see a picture on the right. This is I think this was 10th or 11th. This is 10th grade picture. I don't know if you can find me. I'm kind of pulling a silly face right over here. So this is my 10th grade class. I decided to go into a natural sciences direction. So there are different paths you can take, even in high school. Then you can take natural sciences path or social sciences path. Social sciences is more economics and languages and those kinds of things, not so heavy on math and chemistry, or there is the natural sciences path. So I chose that direction. I'm not sure why, because I wasn't necessarily so good at math and chemistry and those kinds of things, but it was the direction that I think a lot of us and a lot of you in the audience, you read it in the news still, right? It's natural sciences will keep your options open. In terms of, and makes more money when you find a job, or you're more likely to find a job. So that's probably kind of the same reason why I went into the natural sciences direction. And by and large, even though I wasn't a great student, things went pretty smoothly, except for the 11th grade where, it didn't go so well and I almost had to redo that grade. But the last year was pretty smooth. Initially, I wanted to be outside as a job. You do those job questionnaires of what you might want to do when you grow up. And initially, being outside, being in the forest ranger, those kinds of things I was interested in. Now, mind you, being a forest ranger in Holland is different than a forest ranger in this country. You don't wear guns as a ranger in Holland. Here you do. So slightly different, but being outside was what I was interested in. In later years, that shifted more into my interest in being involved with the environment, to help nature, to preserve nature, and to pursue scientific interests that will help me do that. So I actually decided on chemistry after my high school to study chemistry, and that actually turned out to be a little bit of a mistake. I'm not sure how I necessarily could have prevented that, but it wasn't the right direction for me to take. So why did I pick chemistry? I picked chemistry because at the time I thought, well, it really is the foundation of everything. If you understand chemistry, you understand everything about what we consume, what we produce, and therefore we can, with knowledge about chemistry, we can make things better, and we can produce things in a more sustainable way, improve the environment, while at the same time also living a high quality of life. So that was interesting. I think there was, at the time, that rationale made sense. If I had been good at chemistry, I probably would have stuck with it. Unfortunately, I wasn't very good at chemistry. Should have known better probably from my high school years that this wasn't the best route to take, but it is what it is. Organic chemistry was fine. Math, inorganic chemistry, and physics were not so good. Math wasn't that great either. The math is interesting because now I'm an epidemiologist in a discipline that requires calculations, statistics, those kinds of things. Hasn't always been my forte. So as I was going through my year in chemistry, I was actually not particularly happy, pretty miserable. I was commuting, about 2-3 hours a day, wasn't living in a dorm or anything like that. So all of that just didn't really work out for me. One thing that pulled me through during that year was, it was both good and bad. we had a requirement of doing a lab 1.5 days a week. So Monday and Tuesday morning was all dedicated to lab work, experiments, all of that. Lost a few pants along the way, burning holes in my pants. It tells me that I wasn't a good chemist, wasn't doing the proper precautions, safety precautions. But also what really helped was that it wasn't for me. Lab sciences weren't for me. And I was pretty clear about that after this, after one semester was pretty clear, and then I still had another semester to go through that. My lab partners were great. I worked with the smartest people. I was able to pull through for the year reasonably well, and I was able to actually transfer some of the courses over into my next area of study at a different university. So the one thing I liked the best about my time studying chemistry was this course about chemistry and society. And kind of ahead of times, I think, we were writing a report on the environmental impact of regular fracking. Now we're talking about horizontal fracking, but regular fracking was just to get gas and oil from underneath the surface, underneath what we call the Waddenzee, which is a nature area in Holland. So it's actually a lake, or it's the pre-ocean. It's right in front of the North Sea. So there are definitely environmental impacts of that, and our report was about those environmental impacts and the societal and economic impacts. And really a telltale sign for me was that I really should do something different. So I went to a different university to study environmental sciences. And university study was set up a little differently than here at the time. So the first year was your bachelor's, where you had to pass most of your bachelor's to be able to do the remaining 3 years of your study. And that remaining 3 years really, after you completed all of that, you would get your master's degree. So it was a little different at the time than it is now. The current system is more like the US system, but at the time, it was a little bit more efficient, which was good for me when I came to this country. When I applied for my PhD, it was a little challenging because the program that I was applying to did not recognize very easily my transcript. They're like, where's your bachelor's? You only have a 4-year master's degree. So it took a little bit of convincing for them to understand that. Apparently they haven't seen anyone from the Netherlands applying to the program. So I studied environmental sciences initially. That's the major I applied to and got into. And then I focused on environmental health instead, really continuing my interest to study how we impact the environment and thinking of ways to do things more sustainably. I ended up actually doing environmental and occupational health. So this included courses in epidemiology, toxicology, industrial hygiene. But in addition to that, I also did meteorology. It was the best course I've ever taken. It was really awesome. Air pollution, another great course, going out in the field, measuring air quality with different devices. We did courses on water quality and soil quality. So really a mix of fieldwork and didactic courses, really culminating at the end, though, in courses in epidemiology and industrial hygiene, focusing on the work that I currently do. Just an interesting piece of detail. I was on track to graduate with honors or cum laude, but the only courses that prevented me from doing so were my epidemiology courses. I actually got the lowest grades in my epidemiology courses. So, things can happen. Don't get discouraged if you get some lower grades in the courses that you really like, and that doesn't prevent you from actually pursuing a career in that discipline. You just got to keep working at it and find a niche that works for you. As part of this master's degree, we did a study thesis, a master's thesis project. And for that project, we studied air pollution and how it influenced children's respiratory function. So what we actually did was we went to 2 different schools, one urban school in Rotterdam, right next to busy highways, and one suburban school close to where I grew up. And we went to those schools, elementary schools, about 7 times, measuring lung function in all the kids in those schools in one day, which is a lot of work, but it was pretty awesome. And then what we did was correlate those the lung function with air pollution levels in monitors that we had set up on site. We didn't really find a whole lot, actually, probably because the measurement of lung function was pretty challenging, so there was probably a lot of error in that, at least initially, and we probably didn't have a lot of data to statistically test hypotheses and associations. But it was a great learning experience. It also made me realize I probably don't want to do air pollution long term. Everyone was doing air pollution at the time, and it's just, it was a great experience, but I wanted to move on. So fast forward almost 25 years later, I end up doing an air pollution study with my colleague here in Rochester. Even though I swore never to do air pollution again, he pulled me back in many, many years later. And I still realize why I don't really want to do air pollution. So, the things you decide early on that is not for you and the things that are for you, they'll probably stay true throughout your life. And you got to be kind of true to that and really be cognizant of the things you enjoy and the things you're good at and steer your career in those directions. So on the left-hand side here, this is actually the student housing I lived in. I actually lived on the 18th floor. It was great. We had about 15 roommates as part of each of those wings here has about 12 to 15 rooms. So I had that many roommates. It was a great experience. And here are some classmates of mine. Hopefully you can tell who I am. All right. So this is kind of that was my Dutch trajectory. So when I was doing my studies at Wageningen University in environmental and occupational health, because I had transferred in some courses from my chemistry studies, and because I was pretty, efficient, I ended up having significant amount of time to actually study abroad. So that's what I ended up doing. I, tried to be a little adventurous, and what ended up happening, first I wanted to go to Central America to study the health effects of pesticide exposure. And my university, Wageningen University, was originally an agricultural sciences university, so they had a lot of connections with farm workers in Costa Rica and Central America. So originally I wanted to do that. Then I kind of got cold feet because I actually have never been on an airplane before. I've been across Europe, but really not so adventurous. So I decided maybe it's, the US is a better fit for me. And I wanted to just go to someplace pretty, honestly. So what did I do? I ended up looking at places. I did a web search for environmental health departments in places that I thought would be really pretty and awesome. And I ended up writing people, just writing department chairs or contacts that I could find. So this is what I mean with cold emails work. I ended up writing Dr. John Reif, who was the department chair of environmental health at Colorado State University, explained to him my interests and the purpose of my internship. And he said, we don't have any money to pay you, but we have a desk for you and you're welcome to come. And he was really fantastic. He actually ended up arranging student housing for me. So I ended up living in an apartment in Aggie Village. This is the old Aggie Village. The new Aggie Village looks a heck of a lot better. But yeah, he gave me stuff from his basement and old microwaves and plates and silverware. People are really kind. He had his colleagues and his assistant help me with making arrangements financially and otherwise. So it was just a really good setup. And I really think I owe a lot of where I am now really to him. So I ended up going there at the end of October 1997. And the really two things that I worked on, one of them was an ecologic type study on radon and lung cancer. So this is for the Wyoming Health Department. They have pretty significant levels of exposure to radon in the homes. And what they wanted to figure out was whether that had any impact on lung cancer rates across the state. So I did a pretty rudimentary study. I actually still use it as a study of, what really not to do. It's not the best study design, but it worked out pretty well for the purpose there. I actually ended up correlating lung cancer rates by county with radon levels measured by their state health department, and correlating the average radon levels with lung cancer rates and observing some association. So I ended up observing that at the Wyoming First Cancer Control Conference, and what was it, Jasper, Wyoming, many hours drive and pretty much nothingness. It was great. So certainly a great experience for an international student, of someone who grew up in the Netherlands where it's hugely populated. So it was a great experience. I still love the West. The thing that I also worked on was, for the remainder of the time, was study of magnetic field exposure and melatonin levels. So at the time, magnetic field exposure was still believed to impact health. Magnetic field exposure comes from your appliances, from big power lines that you might see in neighborhoods, especially in the West. There were a lot of power lines, and from working in electric utility industry. So there was significant concern that magnetic field exposure could impact health, and one of the mechanisms that people had speculated on was that magnetic fields would impact melatonin. Melatonin is a sleep hormone. You take it when you're flying overseas and try to get your sleep back into rhythm. It's also an antioxidant, and it's supposed to be protective against breast cancer. So we looked at this association, and my work was actually to go out to the homes of people that had participated in an occupational study and measure their home exposure to magnetic fields. So I ended up using this device that detects spikes in, they call it ground currents, in water mains. So usually your electric system is grounded on your water main. When you flip the switch in the home, there will be a current that goes through your water main, and you can actually pick that up in front of the house without ever setting foot on the property. So I ended up measuring these ground currents of all these people that had participated in an occupational study. Very interesting. Some of these homes were in the middle of nowhere. I was walking in front of a big property. Some of them were in neighborhoods, so people were looking very funny at me while I was walking back and forth with this measuring device in front of their home. But I completed that work without harm, so that was good, and did some statistical analyses on that. Never published it, unfortunately. This got me into my interest for magnetic field exposure research even more. So the real reason, though, I stayed in this country is not because of science and research and career and all that. When I was living in Colorado in March, I started dating my girlfriend at the time, and she was a student in the department that I was doing my internship, Colorado State, and she ended up going to North Carolina for her internship in May. So we had dated just for a couple of months. Then she left for North Carolina, and I basically ended up visiting her in the summer in North Carolina, while at the same time trying to find a job. So I must have liked her, right? And actually, she is now my wife. We've been married since 2001. So that was the real reason why I went to North Carolina and why I'm still here. It wasn't really science and research and all of that. It was a personal decision, and I'm just glad that I was able to blend my own life with the things that I love to do, and I was very lucky to be able to find opportunities and people to help me with that. So she moved to North Carolina, and as soon as she moved, I started looking, for opportunities there. So again, cold emails. I actually tried to stay in the country, period. So I emailed UC Davis folks and some other folks. I emailed just because I felt like it, folks in the UK. I actually got a couple of opportunities to interview and get a position for PhD and research assistant type positions. So it was great. Cold emails do work. There are a lot of nice people out there that will pay attention to your emails. Even if you get 20% of your emails back with a response, some of those responses will be positive. You just have to introduce yourself, be really clear on what it is that you want to do, why you reached out to them, what it is about their research that's of interest to you. And people will listen to you and will be willing to talk to you. So I ended up interviewing while I was visiting my girlfriend in the summer, ended up interviewing with folks in the Department of Epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill. And luck has it that they were doing a study on magnetic field research in electric utility workers, and that one of their industrial hygienists on their large study was actually a professor of mine at Wageningen University. And I had no idea that that was the case. So it just all came together. I don't know, things aligned, and I didn't have control over it. But, so that professor knew me, was able to put in a good word in for me. They ended up just having another year of funding on the project that they were willing to spend on me. I'm not sure how that happened, why me versus someone else, but it just all worked out. So, and I ended up being very productive in that job, actually. So the people on the left here that really mentored me during that year, as well as beyond, were Dr. David Savitz and Dr. Dana Loomis. They were the PIs, principal investigators of that magnetic field cohort, occupational cohort, and I ended up publishing a handful of papers in that 1 year. So it was a great experience. So as I was there, of course, I wanted to stick around, and short of actually getting married, the best way to do that was to apply to the PhD program. So I'll get to that in a second. So the work I did during that year when I was a research assistant, sometimes that's the work, sometimes your earliest work receives the most attention. So I've gotten publicized a few times over the years, pretty decent, with my Mercury work that I'll talk about later. We got some press, but this almost got the most press of anything, and this was the work that I did as a research assistant. So what we reported was that workers in this cohort of electric utility workers, the workers that had higher exposure to magnetic fields, had a higher risk of death by suicide than workers with a lower level of exposure. This is one of the first studies on the topic that was actually reasonably well done. There were some other studies that had a different study design, that had more limitations, that had alluded to it. But this was, a better done study than most previous studies. So we got a lot of press on this, BBC News. We almost got onto, Dr. Savitz was almost invited to be on NBC morning show to talk about it. It didn't happen because, I would have been very surprised if it would have happened. But this gained some significant press. It's very interesting. I'll mention later work by one of my students that gained a lot of press as well. And again, that was a master's project. So I'll mention that in a second. And then fast forward 10 years later, I was part of this kind of authoritative group to basically speak to the be-all, end-all of the health effects of magnetic field exposure. And we basically concluded that there was not much going on. But again, you end up in certain situations where you work with people, they give you opportunities, and you end up writing papers and going to places where we talked about this evidence. This was in Edinburgh, Scotland, so it was great to work on kind of authoritative stuff. The only reason I actually participated in this was because Dr. Savitz had by that time left Chapel Hill, UNC, and he didn't want to go to Edinburgh, and he suggested I go in his place. So again, mentors helping out their mentees, current and former. That's really what makes people successful, is the impact of mentors, honestly. So it's, I've had great examples of mentors. So kind of going back, so after that 1 year, I wanted to stay in the country, short of marriage. Being a student would be one of the ways to do that. And I only applied to UNC Chapel Hill. I was already in the department. I was already working with the department chair, Dr. Savitz. So I thought, what else could go wrong? I think I did my GRE. I didn't do really great on my GRE. I was a little overconfident, I think. But despite that, I think I had enough going to get me accepted into this program. And then as I was starting this, I worked with many different faculty on many different papers, at least half a dozen different faculty that I worked with. Mostly I wasn't paid for those papers. It's just getting the opportunity and faculty willing to work with you on doing your research. UNC, I can't say enough good words about that department. It's a big department, it's a well-known department, but faculty have an open door policy. They're always looking out for the best interest of their students, and it's just tremendous opportunity. And again, I'm trying to model that in my own role as faculty now. Open door policy, trying to be available, really looking out for people's best interest. You usually mentor the way you've been mentored, and if I'm a reasonable mentor, that's only because I had great mentors. So 2 people on the right here, Steve Wing, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He was an environmental epidemiologist, really doing community-based participatory research and environmental justice work. So I worked with him on his course in environmental justice, and I'm still using his lectures, his materials on the web, and the things I learned from him in my own course in environmental health. So that kind of I've carried that with me throughout my career. The other person I worked with for a job was Dr. Irva Hertz-Bichodo. We looked at risk assessment, and what we did there was comparing evidence of carcinogenicity, cancer-causing effects of environmental chemicals in animals as well as humans, and whether those results were consistent, and how results from animal models and human studies would impact environmental policy, setting safe levels of exposure, and whether you get the same results from both of those. So we never published anything on that really, but it was a great, it was funded by the government, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, and it gave me a great look behind the scenes of what that organization does and how this work is being used in their daily work. And I learned a lot of good technical skills as well. And I'm still teaching these methods in my own courses. So again, people touching you along the way, and you take that with you, and I've been able to repurpose some of the things I've learned. For my dissertation research, I ended up looking at parental occupational exposures and pesticides, parental occupational exposures to pesticides and solvents, and how it affects childhood brain cancer. So I worked, Dr. Andy Olshan ended up being the department chair after I left there, but he basically just came to me and said, I have a colleague, Dr. Greta Bunin, who has a data set where we haven't analyzed these occupational exposures in relation to childhood cancer. Are you interested? And of course I said, sure, I'm interested. Then I looked at all the jobs that these parents have had and assigned exposures to them with the help of Patricia Stewart at the National Cancer Institute. That's very interesting. We're talking about virtual work these days. I actually had never, even though Greta was the PI of this original study, I never, throughout my PhD studies, never met her in person, always on the phone. And I actually never met her in person until 10 years later. So you can establish great collaborations with someone, even if it's virtual or remotely. And she was a great example. I actually ended up doing another NIH-funded study with her on the same topic. So all of these individuals have played a huge role in my life. They were on my dissertation committee along with Drs. David Savitz and Dana Loomis, and they shaped my career to a large extent. How to do rigorous science, what's the process like, scientific writing on this particular topic. Now, Dr. Olshan actually wanted me to do a postdoc at the National Cancer Institute, and I ended up not doing that because I just felt I wanted to go do, I wanted to jump in. I wanted to get a quote unquote real job. So I ended up looking for faculty positions around the country. I'm not sure I was really ready for faculty positions, honestly. Was probably a little naive in that. Maybe that's the one part where the mentorship that I received wasn't as good as it could have been in terms of next step, job hunting, those kinds of things. So I wrote cold emails, and I actually wrote Dr. Ken Lund, whose picture you see here, about potential job opportunities at UMass, Massachusetts. And the way we ended up selecting a place like UMass is we took a map of the country, my wife and I, and we just marked the states where we wanted to live, and then reached out to potential opportunities in each of those places, in each of those states. So that's what I did. I reached out to him. He actually responded and said, don't have a job at UMass, but I'm also running this consulting company, and I may have a job for you there. So he's awesome. I visited him and his family. I did an interview and ended up getting an offer from him and ended up going there. So great. It was, a great opportunity. I got the job offer in October of 2001. I graduated in April of 2002 and started working there in May of 2002. So I had about 6 months to kind of prepare myself. So what I did at UNC was reading a lot of methods papers, so that, I figured when I'm in consulting, people might ask me for how to do things methodologically, from an environmental, statistical, epidemiologic perspective. So I collected binders and binders of methods papers, and I still have those. And that actually has worked out pretty well, because when I joined the U of R in 2004, I was able to use that knowledge and help students out, and both PhD and master students, with some of the methods questions they had. So it wasn't for naught. This particular job, I figured out after about a year and a half that it really wasn't for me. There was a lot of litigation work, mostly for industry, so a little contentious. They did do some original research studies, but that was really not as important as the litigation work. So I didn't think I could really build a career in litigation. So I started looking at academic positions or university positions, and was told by Dr. Savitz that, you're fine now, but after 2 years being out of academia, you may have a hard time going back in. So kind of fortuitously, I ended up talking to one of my colleagues at University of Albany about environmental exposures and mental health and suicide risk, still one of my interests, and one of the interests that I had in 2002, 2003, published some papers on it. And she referred me to a faculty member here at the U of R, Carrie Knox, who recently unfortunately passed away. But she actually, my colleague at Albany, connected me with Carrie Knox, and Carrie and I started talking about environmental exposures, about suicide risk factors, those kinds of things. And she had mentioned at the time that there was a faculty position open, and if I was interested in applying. And really, initially, I was reluctant. It was Western, or upstate New York. It's when you don't live in New York, you don't appreciate how fair, how New York is set up and the different regions and all that. So initially, I wasn't too keen. But then Dr. Susan Fisher, who was leading the epidemiology division at the time, called me actually on my work phone. It was a day off. So she left me a message. And then I got back to her, talked to her, and interviewed here. And I really liked it. U of R is very collaborative, very friendly faculty. Mentoring is really quite important here, I feel. And I ended up joining here in 2004. So then I've gone kind of through the process, 5 years of assistant professorship, 8 years, looks like 8 years of being associate professor, and then I've been full professor since 2017. And I've had various secondary and adjunct positions on top of this. So this is me on the left in 2004. Only last year I replaced this picture on my faculty website. And then the other people that played an important role in my academic career here at Rochester were Dr. Deborah Corey-Slechta in environmental medicine, renowned neurotoxicologist and a really great translational scientist, and we did some lead research together. And then Drs. Phil Davidson and Gary Myers, who were leading the Seychelles Child Development Study. And they put me on the study as an epidemiologist back in 2005 when they applied for the renewal of their study. So more on that later. So ever since 2004, I've mentored over 85 graduate students, over 50 of those as a primary mentor, mentored the postdocs, several junior faculty. I also oversee some undergraduate programs, and I advise 10 to 20 undergraduates a year. I'm training program faculty on environmental health, biostatistics, toxicology, oral science, and more recently, cancer control. My research side, I've continued to focus on environmental health. One thing I'll say is that when I came here, I was the only environmental epidemiologist in the institution. And it was initially pretty difficult to set up, other than Seychelles study, to connect with other folks that do what I did and who could mentor me in that area. So it took me a little while to actually become an independent investigator, partly because initially I was the only environmental epidemiologist. And other than Seychelles, mentorship, and later on with Dr. Corey Selected, the mentorship started picking up, and I was able to become independent. I did a lot of collaborative and interdisciplinary research, kind of going back to my consulting interest and expertise, really helping other people out with their research projects. And I participated in various center grants, including the CT, the Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, and the Environmental Health Sciences Center. So primarily, really, for my role as someone who mentors reasonably well and who knows methodology. So that really has helped me throughout my career here. And me focusing on that really took away my time to focus on my independent research. And it was kind of a choice that I made, and a choice that I wouldn't necessarily recommend other people making when they're junior investigators, because typically what you should do is don't focus on yourself and your career, get your grants, and then branch out and mentor others and be in other people's grants. I kind of did it the inverse. Worked out for me, but it's not necessarily the best thing to do. And then, so these are my other non-research activities. So I ended up doing quite a bit of administration as well. Again, I'm kind of interested in helping others, and being in an administrative position really helps you do that. So when Dr. Fisher became our department chair, I took over the epidemiology division. I initiated, with help of a group of people, the undergraduate public health related programs in 2009. Then I stepped down from that and took over the PhD program in epidemiology. I started the master's in epidemiology and co-direct the master's in sustainability. So again, a lot of education and mentor opportunities blended with some of my administrative interests. So this has culminated into my current activities. I'm Associate Chair of Public Health Sciences, so now I oversee the strategic direction and administration of about a dozen programs. I oversee the strategic direction of the educational programs managed by the CTSI, and I also direct various undergraduate majors as well as an accelerated program. And as part of my work here, I took the lead in helping the Department of Public Health Sciences move their Masters of Public Health program online. So I took some courses on online teaching myself and talked about my experiences last fall, and that's what you see here on the right, a YouTube video that's been watched 17 times. Maybe I'll get more views after this talk. So the lessons learned here is, rely on your strengths, pursue your interests, don't forget who you are, okay? A little bit of self-reflection is important. And really stick with what you know well and what you're interested in. That'll lower the hurdle of becoming successful. Secondly, I found that there are many people out there really willing to help. A lot of nice people out there, a lot of great mentors out there. Take advantage of those people. Thirdly, you can't be everything to everybody. So when you're in academia, usually it's you need to do research, education, and service. It's very, very difficult to do everything well. I ended up making a choice early on that I really wanted to do more service and education than become an independent investigator, which, again, may not be the best path for most academic researchers out there, because you are oftentimes judged on getting your grants, being an independent researcher, and that usually helps you be promoted to the next phase in your academic career. And then finally, a lot of the reason why I'm here is not because of career and research. It's because I ended up growing a family here. And that's really an important part. And finding the balance of, work life and being with family and trying to not shortchange them as you're pursuing your career is, I think, really, really critical. So since 2005, I've been involved in the Seychelles Child Development Study, first as an epidemiologist. Back in 2010, I started taking over a data office where all the data management took place for the study, because the PI moved, Dr. Davidson moved to South Carolina at that time. So I took over local duties in that regard. And then in 2015, I became the PI of the study, initially with Dr. Davidson, and then a few years ago as primary, as the only PI. And fortunately, I just got an R24 grant for another 5 years of funding. So this keeps us going for a little bit longer to study what we study in Seychelles, which is looking at mercury exposure from eating fish and the impact on health, and especially child neurodevelopment. Okay, so you go to the website. I think I have the link again later. You can just type in Seychelles Child Development Study Rochester in Google, and it'll probably show up as one of the first hits. So mercury is man-made, but also comes from coal-fired power plants and gold mining and other anthropogenic sources. So mercury bioaccumulates in fish. Fish is a primary exposure to organic mercury, which is known to be neurotoxic because of some poisoning episodes in Japan and in Iraq. In Japan, people were eating highly contaminated fish. And in Iraq, people ate bread made with grains that were treated with mercury-based pesticides. Okay, so based on those experiences, huge exposures, up to 2 orders of magnitude greater than you and I would be exposed to, we've seen neurotoxicity in developing children. So based on that, we know that that's a problem. But what about lower levels of exposure from eating fish? Okay, so over the last 20 years, there have been several advisories that the government has published talking about how much fish you can eat and what kind of fish you should be eating. And most of this is based on mercury. What we think is happening as mercury neurotoxicity. Ends up being that actually that literature is pretty inconsistent. So we have the Seychelles study, as well as other studies looking at mercury in child development at very low levels of exposure. And the findings from those studies aren't necessarily too clear. And it's a complicated thing because eating fish comes with fatty acids and other nutrients that are really good and essential for growth and development. But with the package of fish also comes mercury. So really, when you study that, you kind of have to put it all together. Why did we study Seychelles? Is because eating fish is very, they eat a lot of fish. When we started the study in the 80s, they ate 2 fish meals a week on average. In this country, if we eat 2 fish meals a month, it's probably about the average. So they eat a lot more fish, and they have a lot of things in their society that are natural controls for bias. So everyone has access to healthcare and education. There really isn't a lot of industry there with exposures to other chemicals and toxicants. There's no malnutrition. So it's a country that's doing quite well health-wise and child development-wise. So it's a great place to study the impact of fish consumption on and mercury exposure on child development. So these are the 3 cohorts we have studied. One cohort we have followed for 24 years, the main cohort, and then 2 nutrition cohorts. The first cohort we followed for 10 years. The second cohort we followed for 7 years. And actually, the second nutrition cohort, with the new funding we get, will follow now until age 12 or 13. So we'll get them back in and do more assessments on them. And we also will follow the oldest cohorts when they're about 30 years of age. So we get more data on them. So it's a great longitudinal study, and we collect lots of data on them. So what have we found in this study? We haven't found that mercury from eating fish seems to be associated with with child development in this population, even though their mercury exposure is 10 times higher than in the United States. We also studied dental amalgams and mercury exposure from that, and we haven't found any clear associations there. One thing that's still an ongoing question is, well, if we don't find anything in Seychelles, but they report associations with mercury in other populations, why might that be? And that may be because of different exposures to nutrients, different genetic factors, different cultural factors in different societies and study populations. And we still need to tease those out. So these are all the developmental tests we've done on the children in the main cohort. Now they're clearly adults. So we have over 100 tests that we've done in those participants. And we've done very similar tests in each of those nutrition cohorts. Try to be consistent across the cohorts so we can compare the results between the different studies that we publish. So this is our overall paradigm now. We're looking at mercury exposure from eating fish and how it relates to child development, neurodevelopment. We're looking at the impact of nutrients and genetics on that association. And we're also trying to study mechanisms. So we're studying the impact of mercury on inflammation and oxidative stress, on mitochondrial DNA, and on epigenetics, and if that is a pathway by which all of these variables could be connected to neurodevelopment. And last but not least, this is the final slide, just showing you all the data that we have on these cohorts. We have a lot of neurodevelopmental data, neurobehavioral data, physiological data, objective markers of neurological function, growth and development. We have biomarkers of all of these different exposures and cytokines and genetic factors. We have questionnaires that we administered on the diet, on socioeconomic status, on risky behaviors, on medical history. So we have lots of data, and you can really, just looking at this table, you can envision arrows between each of these variables, and each of those arrows could be a manuscript. So there's a lot of opportunity to work with students, and if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to talk about it.